There is a specific moment, and almost no one has ever heard it described accurately, when an empath becomes completely unreachable to the people who used to drain them. Not angry, not cold, not distant, just unreachable. And the people who spent years feeding off their kindness, their patience, their bottomless willingness to understand, to forgive, to show up again and again, those people feel it before they can name it. Something has shifted, something permanent, and no amount of guilt-tripping, manufactured crisis, or love bombing will pull it back. I'm going to tell you exactly what happens inside the mind during that shift, and I mean exactly, down to the neurological mechanism, down to the moment it triggers, down to why it's so quiet that almost no one around the empath even notices it happening. Because once you understand this, truly understand the mechanics of it, you will never again confuse emotional exhaustion with moral obligation. Stay with me. Because what I'm about to share has been sitting inside behavioral psychology and neuroscience research for decades, and almost nobody is connecting the dots the right way. Here's the first thing they don't tell you about empaths. The same trait that makes an empath extraordinary, the ability to feel what others feel, to sense the emotional undercurrent in a room, to hold someone's pain without flinching, that exact same trait, when it goes unprotected, becomes the mechanism for their own psychological destruction. Not the dramatic kind of destruction, not the kind that looks obvious from the outside, the slow kind, the kind where you wake up one morning and you genuinely cannot remember the last time you did something purely because you wanted to. Not because someone needed you, not because you were managing someone else's feelings, not because you were afraid of what would happen if you didn't show up, just because you wanted to. That moment of realizing you can't remember, that's the first signal. And most empaths push it down immediately because sitting with it feels like selfishness. And selfishness is the one identity violation an empath will do almost anything to avoid. But here's what I want you to understand right now before we go any further. What you've been calling selfishness has another name. And by the end of this, you'll know exactly what it is. Now here's where the neuroscience gets remarkable, and I want you to pay close attention because this part is genuinely different from anything you've heard before. There is a structure buried deep inside the human brain called the insula. It sits folded inside the cortex like a hidden room, and in most people it does its job quietly. But in highly empathic individuals, the insula is measurably more active. Neuroimaging studies have shown that when an empath watches someone else experience pain, their own pain networks fire. Not metaphorically, literally. They don't imagine the other person's pain. They process it as if it's happening to them. Now think about what that means for someone who has spent years, sometimes decades, surrounded by people in chronic distress. People who are always in crisis. People whose emotional needs have no bottom. The insula in an empath who has been running without protection isn't just tired, it's overwhelmed. And when that system becomes overwhelmed for long enough, something begins to break down at a level most people never talk about. The empath starts losing the signal that matters most, their own. They know when their partner is anxious before their partner does. They absorb their colleague's stress like it's their own. They lie awake at 2 a.m. carrying the weight of a conversation that had nothing to do with them. But ask them how they feel right now, in this moment, just about themselves? Blank. Not because they don't have feelings, because their nervous system has been so thoroughly occupied with processing everyone else's emotional state that their own has become background noise. This is called empathic overextension, and it doesn't just feel bad, it fundamentally distorts how you see relationships. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Rachel. Rachel doesn't exist as one specific person. She exists as hundreds of real people. Their stories, their patterns, their breaking points. But every word of what I'm about to tell you is real. Rachel was the person everyone called first. Not sometimes, always. Without question, without hesitation, without the brief, uncomfortable pause that most people feel before they ask someone to carry their weight. Her sister called her when the marriage was falling apart. Her coworker called her when the panic attacks started. Her oldest friend called her, not to share good news, but exclusively when things were bad. And Rachel answered every single time, with full presence, with genuine love, with the kind of attention that most people spend their entire lives searching for. But here's what nobody saw. After every one of those calls, Rachel would sit, sometimes in her car, sometimes at her kitchen table at midnight, and she would feel absolutely nothing. Not the warmth of having helped, not the satisfaction of connection, just a flat, gray, hollow emptiness where her sense of self used to be. She told herself this was normal. She told herself this was the cost of caring deeply. She told herself that people who protect their emotional energy are selfish, and Rachel was not going to be selfish. But here is the psychological truth that Rachel had not yet discovered. That emptiness was not the feeling of compassion. That was not what genuine love looks like after it's given. That was depletion. That was a system past its design limit, consuming itself to keep the lights on for everyone else. And here is the part that almost no one talks about, because it's uncomfortable and it's true. When you are that depleted, your judgment changes. When your nervous system is running on empty, the person who keeps draining you feels necessary, feels familiar, even starts to feel like love. Because your brain has been conditioned for so long to associate emotional activation with connection that it can no longer tell the difference between being needed and being valued. This is where empaths get trapped. Not because they're naive, not because they're weak, because their nervous system has learned to mistake intensity for intimacy. And the people who benefit from this confusion, intentionally or not, they learn exactly how much pressure to apply to keep the empath engaged. A well-timed crisis, a subtle signal of distress, a look that says, "You're the only one who understands me," and the empath responds, every time, automatically, because that's what the conditioning expects, until the day it doesn't. And here is where things get extraordinary, because what breaks this pattern is not what most people expect. It is not a dramatic confrontation. It is not hitting a wall and collapsing. It is not even deciding to change. It is a single moment of silence that lands differently than every moment before it. Rachel describes it this way. She was sitting across from someone who was, again, in the middle of a crisis that had somehow become her emotional responsibility to manage. This person was talking, and Rachel was listening the way she always listened. And then, for a fraction of a second, something shifted. She wasn't listening anymore. She was watching. And what she saw for the first time, without the filter of automatic empathy softening everything, was that this person was not in distress the way she had always believed. The emotion was being calibrated, directed. Their eyes kept moving to her face to measure how much it was landing. She had witnessed this exact behavior hundreds of times. But every other time, her brain had immediately reframed it as genuine suffering that needed her response. This time, her brain was quiet. And in that quiet, something that behavioral researchers call implicit knowledge became explicit. She already knew. She had always known. But she had been unconsciously redirecting that knowledge away from her conscious awareness because seeing it clearly would have required her to act on it. This is what psychologists who study motivated cognition call strategic ignorance. The mind knows something that the identity cannot yet afford to know, so it buries it, keeps it in the background, processes it just enough to create a vague feeling of unease, but never lets it surface into full awareness. When Rachel's brain finally let that knowledge through, it didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like relief. The quiet, permanent relief of something that had been held at arm's length for years, finally being set down. Now here's the mechanism that makes this shift so different from anything that came before it. There is a process in interpersonal neuroscience called emotional decoupling. This is not the same as becoming cold. This is not shutting down your capacity to feel. This is your nervous system drawing a line, a precise, deliberate line, between observing someone's emotional state and being obligated to absorb it. Before the shift, the empath's nervous system operates like a building with no exterior walls. Everything outside comes in. Every emotional weather system in the vicinity becomes interior weather. After the shift, there are walls. Not a vault, not a fortress. Walls with windows. They can still see everything. They can still understand everything. They can still choose to let things in. But nothing gets in automatically anymore. And this change, this shift from automatic absorption to conscious discernment, changes every single relationship in the empath's life simultaneously. Because here's what most people don't realize about the relationships around a depleted empath. Those relationships were organized around predictability. The people in them, whether they knew it consciously or not, had learned exactly how the empath would respond in any given situation. Present a problem, receive support. Signal distress, receive full attention. Create a crisis, receive resources. The empath was predictable, reliable, perfectly calibrated to respond. And when that changes, when the empath develops a filter that not every appeal can pass through, it creates what psychologists who study relational dynamics call a disruption event. The pattern that had been working simply stops working, and the people who depended on that pattern have two options. They can adjust, they can show up differently, they can offer something in return, create genuine reciprocity. Become the kind of person whose presence actually fills something rather than draining it. Or they can escalate, push harder, apply more pressure, manufacture bigger crises, deploy bigger guilt, call in every favor the empath has ever owed. And here is the extraordinary thing about what happens next. An empath who has crossed this threshold doesn't respond to escalation the same way anymore. Not because they've become hard, not because they don't care, but because the mechanism that used to make the escalation work, the automatic absorption, the reflexive rescue response, the inability to tolerate someone else's distress without immediately trying to resolve it, that mechanism has been fundamentally altered. The escalation lands, and the empath feels it, and then they make a choice. For the first time in their life, in this kind of situation, they make a choice. And that choice, small, quiet, unremarkable from the outside, is the most powerful thing they have ever done. Now I want to pause here because something important needs to be said directly. This shift is not revenge. It is not hardness. It is not the empath deciding that other people don't matter. It is something researchers in the field of psychological development call the restoration of sovereign agency. The moment when a person stops responding to others from the automatic layer of their nervous system and starts responding from the conscious, choosing layer. This is not a spiritual concept, this is neuroscience. This is the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for deliberate decision-making, finally being allowed to participate in decisions that your nervous system had been making alone for years. And what that feels like, from the inside, is not triumph. It is not victory. It feels like becoming solid. Like something that had been formless and permeable suddenly having a shape and a boundary. Not rigid, not immovable, just real. Present. Specifically itself, rather than a reflection of whoever is standing in front of it. This is what Rachel felt sitting across from that person in that moment of silence. Not anger, not contempt, not even sadness. Just clarity. The clean, permanent clarity of someone who has finally stopped lying to themselves about what they're looking at. Now here is what happens after the shift, and this part surprises almost everyone who goes through it, because it is almost the opposite of what they expected. Most empaths, when they contemplate protecting their energy, imagine loss. They imagine being alone. They imagine the warmth draining out of their relationships. They imagine becoming the cold, self-contained person they always swore they would never be. What actually happens is this. The relationships that survive the shift become something the empath has genuinely never experienced before. Real, reciprocal, present, actual exchange in both directions. Not the performance of a relationship built on one person's endless generosity and the other person's endless need. A real relationship. One where both people bring something. One where both people leave with more than they came with. This is not a small thing. For an empath who has spent years in arrangements disguised as relationships, this is seismic. And the relationships that don't survive? The ones that collapse the moment the empath stops overgiving? Those were never relationships. They were extractions. Transactions in which the empath's emotional resources were the only currency, and the transaction only balanced if the empath kept losing. Losing those is not loss, it is inventory correction. But I want to acknowledge something real here because this process is not painless. The empath's identity is often deeply entangled with the role of the one who gives, the one who shows up, the one who never makes others feel abandoned. And walking away from that identity, even towards something healthier, even towards something more genuinely yourself, feels like grief. Because in a way it is. You are letting go of a version of yourself that carried you through years of difficulty. A version of yourself that was, in many ways, genuinely admirable. The capacity for that level of empathy, for that degree of attunement to others, is rare and valuable and real. You are not destroying that capacity. You are changing its relationship to your life. Instead of scattering it across everyone who makes a claim on it, you are learning to direct it, to invest it, to let it be something you choose rather than something that happens to you. There is a phrase I want to leave you with, because it captures something important about what the empath's gift becomes on the other side of this shift. Before the shift, the empath is a field, open, flat, accessible from every direction. Anyone can walk across it. Anyone can take what they want. After the shift, the empath is a garden. The care is still there, the depth is still there, the ability to grow something beautiful and sustaining in another person is still absolutely, completely there. But there is a gate. And the gate is not designed to keep people out. It's designed to protect what's inside from being consumed before it can grow. Now let me bring this back to you specifically, because if you've stayed with me this long, something in this is speaking to something real in your experience. Maybe you know what it's like to hang up from a call and feel absolutely nothing. Not warmth, not connection, just a hollow, colorless emptiness where you used to be. Maybe you've been circling the edge of this shift for months or years, knowing something needs to change. Getting close to the line and then pulling back because changing feels like betraying the person you've always been. Maybe you've tried to set limits before and the guilt that followed was so overwhelming that you immediately walked them back, told yourself you were being unfair, went back to giving before you'd had a chance to even catch your breath. I want to tell you something directly. The guilt you feel when you protect your energy is not evidence that protecting it is wrong. It is evidence that protecting it is new. Your nervous system has been running this pattern for so long that any deviation from it registers as threat. The identity you've built around being available, around being the one who shows up, around being the person no one ever has to worry about abandoning them, that identity is real and it is embedded, and stepping away from it, even one step, sends alarm signals through your whole system. That alarm is not your conscience, it is your conditioning. And the way to tell the difference is this: ask yourself, does this guilt come from genuinely believing I am harming someone? Or does it come from the fear that someone will be unhappy with me for having a limit? If it's the second one, that is not morality. That is fear wearing the costume of morality. And here is the single most practical thing I want to give you to take into tomorrow. The next time you feel the pull to say yes when everything in you is registering no, pause. Not to think about what the other person needs, not to rehearse how to explain yourself, not to calculate whether your no will damage the relationship. Just pause and ask one question. Is this coming from genuine love, or is this coming from fear? If it's love, energized, freely chosen, sustainable love, give. Fully, completely, without reservation. That is the gift. That is the empath operating at full power. But if it's fear, fear of conflict, fear of disapproval, fear of being seen as selfish, fear of what this person will do or say or feel if you don't comply, then the answer is no. Not a dramatic no, not a speech, not an explanation that you've rehearsed for 10 minutes to make it land softly enough that no one gets upset. Just the quiet, clear, unremarkable no of someone who has decided that their inner world is not a resource that can be claimed by anyone with a strong enough need. That decision, made not once but practiced daily, in small moments and in large ones, is what this shift looks like from the inside. And every time you make it, something happens in your brain that is measurable and real. The neural pathway supporting your ability to choose yourself, to act from sovereignty rather than from fear, becomes slightly stronger. The next time is slightly easier. The time after that, easier still. And the reverse is equally true. Every time you override your own signal, every time you give from guilt, absorb what you should let pass, say yes when your whole body is saying no, the old pathway gets reinforced. It becomes harder to break. This is why the moment of the shift matters so much. Not because one decision rewires everything, but because the first genuine conscious choice to protect yourself creates a reference point that your nervous system has never had before. Proof that the sky doesn't fall. Proof that you can say no and still be a good person. Proof that the relationships worth keeping don't evaporate when you ask them to be real. And it's that proof, accumulated over time, one quiet choice at a time, that transforms the empath from someone who gives until there's nothing left into someone who has so much to give that the giving itself becomes a joy. Not an obligation, not a compulsion, not a survival strategy. A genuine, sovereign, deeply personal choice. This is what becomes possible when an empath finally, truly, permanently decides to protect their energy. Not the end of their compassion, the beginning of its real power. If something in this video names something you've been living, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not because it will get this channel more views, but because you already know someone who is sitting in their car right now, feeling nothing, and wondering why caring so deeply for everyone else leaves them feeling so completely alone. They deserve to know what's actually happening, and now you can tell them.